Hello, welcome everyone to the latest in this Ideas SSCR series of lectures on COVID-19 and the impact on the economy. We are absolutely delighted today to have with us Martin Abeles. Martin is the director of ECLAC in Buenos Aires, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. He's the director in the Argentina country office. Martin studied economics at the University of Buenos Aires and then at the New School of Social Research in New School University in New York. And he has been in many, many important positions. He's been a fellow in Flaxo in Argentina. He's been the director at the CEFID Argentina. And of course, I also met him when he was involved in several important positions in the Ministry of Finance in Argentina. And he has, of course, a very excellent understanding of all the things that have been going on in the Argentine economy. But particularly, he has a very good grasp overall of the trends in Latin America and the current position with respect to how it's dealing with COVID-19. So really, we're absolutely delighted to get a chance to hear from him. So over to you, Martin. Please do start.
Well, thank you very much, Jayati. Thanks to you and other organizers for the invitation. Let me upload my presentation. Where is this? You can see it, right? Can you hear me well? And do you see the presentation? Yes? Okay. So, well, as Jayati said, I will be talking about COVID-19's impact in South America. That means that I will be, as a first clarification, excluding Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean. The main difference between South America and the latter countries is South America's specialization in primary commodity production and the close dependence of Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean on the United States economy, both with regards to remittances, tourism, and of course, the US market as a market for, say, Mexican manufacturers. I will be presenting some work I've done with my colleague in ECLAC, Martin Cherkassky, whose name is right there, and will be basing my presentation on these three special reports which ECLAC has launched in the recent weeks, in the past weeks, regarding precisely the effect and impact of COVID-19 in our region, especially number 2 and number 3 reports. And these reports are in English, so I recommend whoever has the time and interest to take a look at them. I will be dividing my presentation in 2 parts. The first part, I will be describing the pre-COVID-19 situation in South America, and then go to the impact, the main policy measures and outlook of in the region with regards to COVID-19. We thought that presenting a baseline of the situation in the South American sub-region was important because, as you will see, COVID-19 did not hit a thriving, growing region, but rather a stagnant, pretty much in all countries, situation. So let's move right to the figures. By the way, I should mention that even if I will be using mostly ECLAC data and ECLAC's analysis, many of the opinions I may provide here might be my own alone and not ECLAC's institutional opinions, right? Well, here you can see a clear trend. As of approximately mid-2014, South America began to decelerate consistently from an average growth rate of 4.6% in 2013 to a negative 2.6 growth rate in 2019. The prospect for this year, 2020, before the COVID crisis hit our shores, was a partial recovery to barely above 0%. So this is a clear downward trend, which is already 6 or 7 years long and prior to the COVID crisis. On average, as you can see on this slide, the 04-08 growth rate was above 6%, and for the period beginning at 2014 up to 2019 was barely above 0%. So someone might say, well, this includes countries like Venezuela. So this is how the story goes when you exclude Venezuela. Even when excluding Venezuela, who, as you know, is undergoing a severe socioeconomic crisis and has been going through that for some years now, even excluding Venezuela, the average growth rate for the region was only 1.9% during that period. But then again, Brazil and Argentina are included in that average and have not been doing well either in the last 5-6 years. For example, Brazil's GDP fell by a compounded 7% between 2015 and 2016. And in the case of Argentina, Argentina has had negative growth in 4 of the last 6 years. So one excludes Argentina in order to make sure, and Brazil and Venezuela, in order to have a cleaner look on these figures. One sees that average growth rates are still pretty low, and say the 2.6 average growth rate for the latest period includes 2 extraordinary situations, those of Bolivia and Paraguay. Bolivia grew at a 4.5% rate during that period, and Paraguay at a 3.5% rate. These are the smallest countries in the region, and if one excludes those countries, the average growth rate is barely above 2%. And this is roughly what you need in this region if you want just to absorb the growth of your population. So this is really mediocre growth, if anything, and certainly nothing close to a growth success story, let alone a development success story. Of course, I will be showing you later what our new projections for the region are after assessing the COVID impact. Just so that you have a broader spectrum, these growth rates are really low also when comparing to other developing regions, as you can see in this graph. Of course, this low growth for the past six years came together with, I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly, growing unemployment, rising poverty rates, and falling investment rates, which are pretty low compared, say, to many Asian economies you might be more acquainted with. Why has this been the case? Why have these countries been growing so slowly and on a decelerating trend? And recall, this is prior to COVID-19's impact in the region. Well, of course, there are several explanations to this. For orthodox economists, this is very much a story of institutions in a, say, second generation reforms type of approach, or in a neo-institutional type of approach concerned with appropriability, business climate, excess regulations, etc. I don't want to go into too much discussion about that literature, that line of interpretation. Of course, institutions are important. Maybe there's not only one way by which one can look at institutions, but if one takes a structuralist perspective, This is in no doubt a clear case of a binding foreign sector constraint. So let me show you some data. If one takes a look at export growth in the region, in real terms, that is, without taking a note of international price evolution, growth rates of exports fell from almost 8% in the 04-08 period to below 2% in the latest period. So this is a drastic fall in export performance across the board, pretty much in all countries in South America. And this is not only due to the global slowdown in trade, which you must sure be acquainted with. It is also related to a reduction of export elasticities. With the sole exception of the country of Paraguay, every single country in South America saw its export elasticities fall during between the decade that goes from 98 to 08 and the period that covers 2010 and 2016. So this is not a trend that is explained just by a slowdown in the world economy, a slowdown in the world trade, but it is also explained by some kind of, let's say, detachment of the region from world growth. Recall Thirlwall's law. Thirlwall's law would, for those who are economists, would affirm that one of the key factors that establishes long-term sustainable growth in peripheral countries from the point of view of the balance of payments is export elasticities. And these have been falling consistently over the past 20, 25 years in South America. I'm missing one. Well, this came, let me go. I'm missing one slide, but I'll tell you about it. So this came together, this reduction in export growth with rising current account deficits. And as you may figure, current account deficits must be financed by foreign borrowing, both from the public sector and the private sector. So what comes together with this deceleration in export growth is our growing current account deficits that could never improve beyond -2%, not even in the latest years of very slow growth. At the same time, external debt, as measured in terms of GDP, grew from roughly above 20%, 23%, to above 40% between 2010, 2011, and 2018. So this is a story of growing external vulnerability with very low growth of exports, increasing external debt, and increasing dependence on capital inflows in order to keep the economy running, even in times of very low growth. This is a general indicator we've put together to assess external vulnerability. It's a very simple indicator. It is built by computing external debt net of international reserves and as a ratio, as a percentage of total exports. So your external vulnerability will increase if your external debt grows, if your international reserves fall, or if you're not doing well in terms of exports, and vice versa. And as you can see from the aftermath of the 08-09 crisis, this indicator has increased by a factor of 4. So summing up for this first part of the presentation regarding the pre-COVID situation in South America, one may say two things. For once, well, one may say Raul Prebisch was right in the sense that if you specialize in primary commodities alone, this might seriously hurt your growth. And among other reasons, because you're overly exposed to sharp fluctuations, which are typical in international commodity prices. And as we can see here, this is exactly what happened this year in the first month of the years in the midst of the COVID outbreak, especially, as you all know, in the case of oil, but not only in the case of oil, see the fall in the price of copper and also in agricultural goods and meat. But also Keynes was right in the sense that, well, he used to say above all, and I do recommend this essay on national self-sufficiency from 1933, that you want your finance to be primarily national. Among other reasons, he would argue, you don't want to be excessively exposed to international liquidity cycles. And again, this is exactly, as you probably all know, what happened in the past couple of months. Flight to quality and sharp and very intense and massive outflows from peripheral countries, emerging markets and developing economies to central economies. And this gave way to important increases in country risk premia and important depreciations of national currencies across the region. So in a nutshell, what you have prior to COVID, to COVID-19's impact in South America is a low-growing sub-region, very exposed to volatile international commodity prices, very dependent on capital inflows to finance its current account deficits, including short-term capital inflows. So in this context, COVID-19 is typically a story of when it rains, it pours, at least in the case of South America. So let us now turn to the impact of COVID-19 in our region. How do we assess? How can we assess this impact? Well, there are various elements or factors that one has to put in place before considering the effect of compensating policy measures. For starters, of course, the production pattern. Here we see that oil producers, oil exporters such as Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador will be much more exposed to ongoing events than, say, agricultural exporters as Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, or Paraguay, with Chile, Colombia, and Peru and Bolivia in the middle, who export mineral primary goods or natural gas, as in the case of Bolivia. Also, the exposure to the US economy. Ecuador and Colombia have a much more important trade relation with the US, who's going to be hit hard, than other countries in the regions who are mostly who are more dependent and more related for the past 10, 15 years to the Chinese economy as primary commodity exporters. So this is the first factor. Tell me what you export, I'll tell you how hard current circumstances will hit you. Second, as I mentioned earlier, your foreign sector vulnerability. Here, we're using the same indicator I presented, before. Net external debt, the net external debt to export ratio. Here, not surprisingly, Argentina is the most vulnerable country in terms of its net external debt. We are using this indicator as a proxy for policy space, both monetary and fiscal policy space, we are this is a long discussion, and we could spend some days talking about this particular macro issue. What does fiscal space depend upon in peripheral countries? Our take on this is that the most important restriction for all peripheral economies, including, of course, South American economies, is the foreign sector constraint. So in order to tell how much fiscal and monetary effort can countries engage in order to counteract the effect of the COVID crisis, one has to see this, if the foreign sector vulnerability. And here, as I told you, Argentina ranks first in terms of vulnerability, and Peru, Paraguay, Bolivia rank last. We'll come to this later again, because the size of the fiscal packages that have been put forth in order to counteract the effects of the COVID crisis are not completely independent of this type of this measure policy space. So then, of course, another factor which will affect how hard the impact of COVID-19 will be in the region is the sanitary resilience. I'm no expert on health systems, but here what we have is just one indicator of many other possible indicators of the strength of the health system in different countries. This is a number of hospital beds per 1,000 people. And here, Bolivia and Paraguay, Venezuela reverse orders with Argentina. Argentina ranks first in terms of sanitary resilience, and these other countries rank last. Why is this important? Because one can presume that a stronger health system requires less of severe measures of distancing or lockdown than a weaker health system that has to flatten the curve in order not for their health systems to get congested. We know this story well, as we saw this happening in Western Europe. So imagine what could happen in South America. And we know, for that matter, that the pandemic is currently heading south, if we take a look at the latest figures. Last but not least, informality rates. This is a very important feature of not only Latin American economies and Caribbean economies, but I'm sure that's the case as well in Southern Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and so on. So as we've all seen in the latest month, high informality rates, informal workers and their families are much more difficult to reach through public policies in order to supplement their income, provide cash transfers, food, whatever. But this is not just a matter of high informality. What we are seeing in a closer look, I cannot show you this now because we're still working on that, is that the most severely affected sectors due to the COVID crisis, say construction services, restaurants, retail, of course, tourism, these sectors have a much larger incidence of informality than these average sectors that I'm showing you here. And also, these sectors also portray a larger incidence of women's work, of work by the indigenous peoples in these countries, and by Afro-descendants. So this is a very unlucky point in the COVID crisis, that it is hitting those sectors where labor informality is larger, where female work is more important, and where other where minorities such as the indigenous people and and Afro-descendants are also very relevant. And this is an important transmission mechanism that reinforces the negative effect on the demand side from lockdowns and social distancing. So how hard will this crisis hit South America? Well, on average, this will provoke a GDP fall of minus 5.3%. This is a projection which is 2 weeks old. This will be the most severe economic contraction ever, even when compared to the crisis of 1914 or the crisis of 1930 in the region. If one looks at the different countries, Argentina and Ecuador are the ones that will be hit worse, falling by more than 6% this year, followed by Brazil with a fall of 5%, 5.2%, and then comes Chile, Peru, Uruguay, and so forth. Paraguay will only fall by 1.5% according to our latest projections. Of course, poverty rates will increase. Here is an estimate of the possible increase in poverty rates, which does not take into account the compensatory measures, which I'll be moving on to explain in a few seconds. Unemployment rates are expected to grow. Of course, on average, a 3.4% increase for all countries in the region. All countries will be shifting to double-digit unemployment rates. And this will, of course, not only increase poverty rates, but also inequality, of course. These are, as I said, these projections are 2 weeks old. We've already seen some other more pessimistic projections. I'm not sure what will happen to our next projections in ECLAC, but I'm pretty sure they will not be revised upwards. So which have been the main policy measures that countries have taken in order to compensate for COVID? Countries have been very, very active, one must say, or most countries have been very active and proactive, and very early on established different quarantine or social distancing or lockdown measures in order to contain the local spread of the virus. This includes, travel restrictions, distant learning, homeschooling, of course, the closure of restaurants, bars, etc., etc., etc. Argentina, Bolivia, Chile. Chile not so much. Argentina, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Paraguay, and Peru and Venezuela. All these countries established very strict lockdowns very early on, and are now in some cases beginning to relax those measures. In the case of Chile, the approach was more gradual. It was there were partial lockdowns at the beginning, and now they're pretty much in a very strict lockdown after an increase in the contagion rate. What else? Uruguay has put forth voluntary measures and is doing pretty well as well, but with less strict measures of social distancing and lockdowns. And Brazil has different attitudes depending on governments at the subnational level and what the national government says. As you know, contagion rates in Brazil are pretty high right now. But let us take a look at this map. Hopefully, again, there we go. This is just for you to have an idea, as measured by the change in traffic congestion, which countries in the region have been more aggressive in terms of lockdowns and social distancing, and which have been less aggressive. And as you see, Chile, Brazil, and Uruguay have been less strict, and Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru have been among the most strict and aggressive countries in terms of social distance measures. So this is on the sanitary side. What about the social protection side? Well, social protection measures have been very broad, and there's probably no social protection measure that has been tried in the region, from new cash transfers programs to the expansion of the existing programs, from in-kind transfers of food and masks and medicines to the provision of basic services, say the foregoing the waivers on electricity, gas, and ICT receipts, etc., and some pension-related measures as well. So, as I said before, the most creative and interesting part of the story is the ingenuity by which different countries have tried to reach informal workers and their families. Most countries had already in place many cash transfer programs, typically conditional cash transfer programs, but these programs did not reach the entire population, did not reach the entire informal workforce, and as these sectors of the economy, as these parts of the population are the ones that will be most hardly hit, as I assume will be the case in Asia and Africa as well. There has been a lot of effort in trying to reach out to these sectors. So aside from the political or ideological colors of the different governments, there has been a strong and proactive energy put forth in this sense. Same with the preservation of productive capacities, from subsidized wages to formal workers, to the suspension of employer contributions to Social Security, tax reliefs, soft credits to small and medium enterprises, you name it. All these policies have been put forth by different countries across the region, and in some cases with a pretty engaging in important fiscal efforts in order to accomplish this. So, speaking of fiscal efforts, what are the size of fiscal packages involved once one takes account of social protection measures, the strengthening of the health systems, and the policies meant to preserve productive capacities, and so on and so forth. The fiscal packages involved go from, say, barely above 1% in Uruguay to 7% in the case of Peru. As you see, Peru and Brazil are the countries whose fiscal package is the most aggressive thus far, measured as in terms of GDP. Now, and I'm getting to close now. So interestingly, when one compares these fiscal packages to the external vulnerability indicators we saw previously, it is Peru and Brazil, the countries that have been putting forth a more significant fiscal package with their social and productive policies. These are the countries which have a lower exposure to external vulnerability, as you can see there. Paraguay is another country with a very low external debt, net of international reserves, but the fiscal package is much lower, though Paraguay still is expected to fall the least among these South American economies, and is doing pretty well in terms of contagion rates and so on. On the other extreme, Argentina, not surprisingly, is the country with a more vulnerable situation, but interestingly, it is not the country with a lower fiscal package in place. Colombia, Uruguay have relatively low fiscal packages compared to Peru and Brazil, and Chile is somewhere in between. Let me wrap up so that we go to questions and answers, and you tell me where discussion should go to. Well, as I said, the COVID-19 will cause the most severe recession ever in South America, probably the most recession severe ever in many countries in the world, or in the world as a whole. But recall that South America was already experienced very mediocre growth prior to the COVID-19 crisis. This is not a crisis that hits a thriving region. This is not a crisis that interrupts success growth story. This is a crisis that hits a stagnant region or relatively stagnant region, highly exposed to various international volatilities, including international commodity prices and international liquidity cycles, for one. Unemployment will rise very sharply, and large sections of the population, especially informal workers, will lose their incomes. And very much so in the case of women, indigenous people, and Afro-descendants, and of course, as well, migrants. So even if social protection spending is growing importantly in many countries, say, Argentina has put together an emergency family income which has reached 8 million people in a population of 44 million. Brazil's Corona voucher, so-called Corona voucher, which is also very important, is reaching 50 million people in a country of 210 million people. So, but despite all this increase in social protection, poverty and inequality will inevitably rise, and very significantly. So this is why from ECLAC we're concerned about the need to strengthen all these social protection measures and make them available for a longer period of time. In special report number 3, you can read one of ECLAC's proposals recommending a 6-month emergency cash transfer program equivalent to 1 poverty line for every person below the poverty line. Interestingly, such a program, such a 6-month program, would have an additional cost of only 2% of GDP, on top of what governments are already spending in social protection. By the way, these calculations are for Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole, not just for South America, but they give you an order of magnitude about how costly such, or not so costly, such a measure should be. But now, in the short term, to the extent that policy space depends on external vulnerability in countries like South American countries, this will require greater external finance, greater external funding, including from multilateral bodies. This has been happening to some extent already. Chile has recently asked and received a flexible credit line from the IMF. Colombia was already entitled to a flexible credit line. Colombia is also has an agreement with the United States Federal Reserve. Same with Brazil. Bolivia has just received a rapid disbursement from the IMF as well. Ecuador has also received finance, but it is not clear that these financing instruments will be enough if the crisis is a protracted one, and the emergency social protection measures need to be kept in place for more than just 2 or 3 months, as we are currently implicitly assuming. So in the short term, to be sure, countries need more external financing. This should come from multilateral bodies. In some cases, this might involve debt relief. In some others, such as in the Caribbean, as ECLAC has been posing for the last years, it might involve debt forgiveness. To be sure, Argentina needs debt restructuring, but that is a different story, ongoing, by the way. Now, in the medium to long term, more bold or bolder changes need to be put forth. I would say that, as in most countries in the world, certainly in South America, the COVID-19 crisis revealed the weakness of the region's development model. As I said before, even if countries in the regions were not in the press lately, with the probably exception of Argentina's debt restructuring, this was by no means a development success story. If anything, it was, or it could be posed as a macro stabilization success story, but at a very high cost in terms of development, inequalities, and so forth. So in the medium to long term, a bolder transformative agenda is probably needed. I'm sure large parts of the audience will agree with that. And the need to go beyond just incremental changes, about extending existing programs, increasing cash transfers, and so on and so forth. We need to, I would close in saying this, rethink developmental states as we usually think of them. And I think the current conjuncture, the critical circumstances we're going through, as is usually said, comprise an interesting opportunity, and we don't want that opportunity to go wasted, as they say. So I will leave it there, Jayati. I think I used 40 minutes, so that was pretty much in time, and I'm open to any questions, comments, whatever you suggest. Thank you very much.
So listen, unfortunately, my camera has stopped working. Oh, no, it's back. Great. Okay, good. So thank you, Martin. That was excellent and so crisp and so well organized that you've covered a huge amount of material in a relatively short time. So look, there are lots of questions, but I'm going to actually first abuse my position by asking you, because that was a fascinating chart you did about the fiscal space, which you defined in terms of foreign exchange, the debt requirement relative to your foreign exchange reserves, and the amount of fiscal spending. You know, the one you did with Argentina, 3.5, Brazil, and which was the other country with very high expending and so on. Why that is so interesting for us here is that, you know, in India, by your definition, we would have a lot of fiscal space because our external debt is really quite low relatively. And yet we are certainly relative to our foreign exchange. And yet we have not, the government of India has barely spent at all. I mean, the fiscal element of its announced package is less than 1% of GDP. And it's not doing any of the social protection measures, which when we hear about, we're really jealous. So what explains this overall trend in Latin America, which is obviously unrelated to ideological orientation, as you said, that it's not, you know, it doesn't depend on which kind of government you have particularly, but in general, everybody is pushing. What is it that, what's the political economy of a region that enables this?
Well, that's a very good question. First, I would say that there's a lot of political economy in that graph. First, I would say that all these fiscal packages do not necessarily imply stimulus packages yet. And as we forecast, economies will fall significantly this year, even after these fiscal packages. As what's interesting to me about fiscal space and the fact that countries in Latin America and in general, not only in South America, are engaging in important social protection programs and company rescue programs and worker sustenance programs, is that why didn't that fiscal space, to the extent that we're finding it now, didn't show up previously while we had such mediocre growth rates? So this is very much, as you posed, a very political economy question. So it turns out that when, you know, if fire arises, break the glass. So the fiscal space was there, but it was not meant to be used. So my suspicion is that the narrative of scarce fiscal space is more a distributional narrative, a device to prevent the type of spending that could reduce inequalities that a financial argument or a macro financial argument proper. Having said this, we are not in a region, and this is probably different in India, which can afford a whatever it takes policy without a close look at the foreign sector constraint. So it's different if you are Peru, Chile, or Colombia, or Brazil than if you're Argentina or Ecuador in the midst of IMF standby agreements. See? But there seems to be a lot of room between a binding foreign sector constraint and the actual use of fiscal space. So I'm assuming that what you're going at is the political economy of the subutilization of fiscal space in the case of India, which I don't know in detail, but I'm assuming that's what's going on. So if there's no foreign sector binding constraint, fiscal space is probably much larger. And if it's not there yet, it's probably for distributional reasons rather than for macro financial concerns.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, yes, it's driving home to us how much we still have to be jealous of you lot, despite your fiscal constraints at the moment. So, Martin, there's a whole bunch of questions on informality. So I'm going to just read out some of the questions and you can answer all of the informality related questions. In the post-COVID situation, how do you see the potential of the informal sector in the economy, considering that its workers have been the hardest hit? Will economic contraction increase informalization, or would we see a destruction of the informal economy? And related to that, what would happen to the social protection policies then? Another question, it's interesting that you say the high proportion of informal or of the informal sector or informal employment is the unlucky part for South American countries. But it's our understanding that successive governments have promoted informality or obstructed formality over the past 30 years. Finally, do you think that the COVID pandemic will lead to a rethink on state policy promoting informality? For example, in India, many state governments are actually moving in the opposite direction towards more informality by suspending labor and industry regulations to boost the economy. So is that kind of thing possible in Latin America as well?
Wow, that's a lot. Let me think.
But all on informality.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Very interesting questions. I'm not sure I took all of them down. Well, for starters, of course, informal workers will be the most hardly hit. And as someone said, I do agree on the fact that high informality is not just an unlucky feature, but to a large extent, an endogenous feature, a consequence of liberalization and deregulating policies, and especially deindustrialization policies in the past 3, 2, or 4 decades, depending the case in South America. So of course, this is not just an unlucky exogenous misfortune. It is to some extent the result of more than 2 decades of primarization policies, among other things. But interestingly, governments have taken notice of this due to the emergency of this kind of loophole. Is that the right word? In the social protection, in this void in the social protection system. So adult workers, male or female, with no kids, are probably outside of the social protection radar. And this could involve millions of people in the countries where there are cash transfers for the kids of the children of informal workers. So somehow governments came to note that the millions of informal workers that fall outside the social protection screen that need to be some way or another taken care of. So, of course, another endogenous feature, government capabilities to do this are not so strong as we might have hoped, because welfare retraction on welfare in the past decades, although there was a lot of improvement in South America between 2003, 4 and 2013, 14, still those improvements did not make up for a broader general retraction of the welfare state, let me call it that way, even if you cannot compare it with a European welfare state. And so the instruments to reach that part of the population were not in place. But the cash transfers are getting there, and creativity is on the rise, and electronic and digital means are being used in order to reach those parts of the population. Not fully effectively, but at least the effort is being done. So what I think is that a lot of the social policy or the social policies that we've been pursuing will be rethought after this, hopefully for the best. If this is a positive sign or not, I don't know, but employment of last resort ideas, universal basic income ideas. ECLAC itself is proposing medium to long-term reform towards universal income policies. So these are the kind of things that were not so high up in the agenda only 3 months ago, and they are now, and they target directly the problem of informality. So I don't want to be overly optimistic, but these things were not being discussed lately. And as I said, all countries are reaching precisely the informal workers and their families in their measures to the extent that they can, with the resources, both institutional, technical, and financial, they can bear.
You know, one of the things you said about the primarization of the economies relates to this question. How much of the dependence on primary commodities is by choice or by policy? And how much of it is by the country's inability to move on to higher value products due to the process of globalization?
Well, same answer as the one before. Yeah, of course, you have to deal with what nature gave you, and this is the commodity lottery, as it is usually called. But the fact that countries have not been able to diversify, to promote more dense linkages upstream and downstream to whatever the primary natural resources are, is of course, it's not just a matter of unfortunate fate, but it is the endogenous effect of social and political choices that have been done in the past. I would say two things on that front. Someone at a very high political level in the 90s quoted Gary Becker and said, the best industrial policy you can have is having no industrial policy. This is a famous phrase. And this was repeated across countries in South America back in the 90s. We're no longer living there. We're no longer in that situation in any country, I would say, in Latin America, not just South America, at present. But even so, industrial and technological policies, even if they have been enhanced, even if almost every country has a science and technology ministry, etc., they are way behind what some people think they should be in terms of the centrality, their budgetary importance, in terms of how they organize the narrative around the development model, etc. So we're not there either. So we're no longer in a full-fledged neoliberal stance with regards to industrial and technological policies in this region, but we're still very far away from, in general terms, I'm talking not pointing to one country or another, but we're very far away from giving this part of the policy agenda the importance it should have. So we are moving much more slowly than other countries and lagging behind. And the meager growth rates which I showed you are a predictable consequence from that lack of interest or of more interest in and centrality of industrial and technological policies.
So there are many questions. I'm going to have to choose some. There's one about food. And this is interesting because, you know, there's been a lot of talk about a sort of pending global food crisis and food shortages, and even China moving to establish more control over long-term imports of certain food items. So the question here is, many countries in South America have a long tradition of cash transfer programs. Some of them, like Brazil, also have big school meal programs. But most countries do not maintain large food grain stocks anymore. Do you think there might be some rethinking in food policies, in particular moving towards more national security in terms of securing food supplies?
I'm not sure I'm going to respond exactly what you're asking, but I'll try to elaborate a bit. So many countries in this region are net exporters of food.
Okay.
So the problem in this region is inequality. So we have countries which can feed several times their population. That is the case, in fact, of Argentina, and you still have severe poverty rates, which are not negligible. But this is not because we don't have food, but it's a problem with income distribution. So, and other countries don't have supply problems, and much of their food or the wage goods basket is non-tradable. So you don't need to hoard or to, prevent exports in order to maintain food security, as happens sometimes in some Asian countries from what I've read. So in terms of food proper, what the type of policies that what one has seen around is, in some countries, price controls. So you want to regulate some key essential good prices. You see in-kind transfers of food in many places, it is typical of many Latin American countries that schools are not only schools, but places where children also get 1 or 2 meals a day. With homeschooling, you have to rearrange this type of schemes, and in order for families, not just the kids, to get this food now in their homes and not just in school. So people have to go to school and get their basket for a couple of days so that they don't have to go out every day for social distancing sake, etc. So I would say that the food problem is different in this region than in other regions. It's not a problem of shortage, it's a problem of price and access and of low income. So the policies are meant to increase income in order for people to be able to buy food, which has been already produced, or to get in-kind transfers of food, and some control, depending on the country, on prices as well in times of emergency, so that there's no speculation, and that reduces effective disposable income of poor families to buying, the food they need.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so Martin, this is the final question, but you let yourself in for this one, which is really that, what is, that you mentioned that these, doing more of the same or a little bit better of the same is not going to be enough, and you need a transformative agenda. So what would be the elements of the transformative agenda that you consider are significant for Latin America? And in particular, how would they also merge with the other wider discussions that are going on about climate change, a Green New Deal, and so on?
Well, I've only started to think about this, as probably all of you are. Let me first put it historically, and then just try to tag a few names so as to be optimistic about the development agenda. I think that when the kind of three positions in the discussion about the future of the state worldwide, this is my personal view, of course, and I haven't thought through this too much, but let me put the conservative position, and you see it everywhere, some concerns about overstretched governments after this crisis, too much government intervention that cannot be rolled back after the crisis, the risk of redistributive agendas getting locked in. So there's a concern, there's a clear conservative neoliberal concern about some of the things that are being done by everyone now to be to remain for some time looking forward, and one would say what some of the good things in terms of social protection and the enhancement of welfare regimes. So there's this position, and I see this position very active, by the way. I see this position very active. Then there's another view. This might me call it romantic, the idea that the welfare state is coming back. I call it romantic because, well, when you go back to a welfare state in the good old golden years of capitalism, and bewaring of the fact that it was a central economy thing, not necessarily a peripheral situation, this was part of a compromise between capital and labor in a geopolitical context very specific of tension between the East and the West. I don't think, even if this the welfare state of the good old golden years was much better than what came after that in the neoliberal era, that it is very wise to think about going back to that kind of situation, because in history you don't go back. And the actual circumstances that made that possible um, are not there at present. That doesn't mean one has to be pessimistic. One has to be transformative. We have to think the welfare state, the welfare regime we need looking forward. And in that sense, I think we need to, that's what I said, we need to rethink the developmental states as we know them, because we have in mind, say, in Latin America, the import substitution, industrialization developmental states. In East Asia, you have that's what actually the term developmental state was kind of invented, etc. But I think the new developmental state will have to go along 3 lines, and I'm not ready to elaborate on this, but I'm sure this will have to be taken care of, and this is very much in line with the rights approach. First, it has to be green. It has to have an environmental agenda, a built-in environmental agenda, and the environmental and green agenda has to be a lever for transformation, not a blockage for transformation. Second, it has to be universal. It has to be based on the rights approach. And this is what we see some light here, because governments across the region, at least here, are being, at least temporarily, more universal in their approach to social policy. And third, and this is probably a new form of mixed economy will have to be thought of. I think there's a lot of discussion going on already as to public involvement in production, at least in strategic sectors, health-related, etc., but also with regards to renewable energies or other rights or other development concerns. And the legal contours of future public involvement in production might still have to be drafted. As you know, some countries are renationalizing large enterprises. Most countries are subsidizing wage bills. Now, how is this gonna pursue if the crisis is not just a short-term crisis with a V-shaped recovery, but it takes much longer, and as many people are presuming now, to be over. So I think these type of interventions on the private sector might give rise, but need to give rise to different types of public involvement in production, which does not necessarily mean, you know, a super 180 degrees radical reform, but probably something that we haven't seen yet in capitalism. And many things, as some of the institutions that were put forth during the golden years of the second post-war period, had not been invented in the 1930s or in the 1914s. So there's no, we shouldn't be pessimistic about that. We should be proactive and creative. And I would suggest that we don't be romantic in terms of excessively wishful as to going back to some institutions we might rather prefer from neoliberal institutions, but that you know, might be obsolete in terms of historical circumstances. So I would leave it there, but it's green, it's universal, and it will definitely involve public production.
Wow, thank you so much, Martin. That was such a thoughtful answer and quite inspiring in its own way. I have to say, I'm still jealous. You know, you're talking about how everywhere they are nationalizing production and certain enterprises. And here we are in India privatizing the existing state ones and getting rid of labor laws and doing the opposite. So yeah, all kinds of different tendencies in response to this. But I think I agree with you that overall, globally, there is going to be which actually is going to provide us different avenues, some alternatives to imagine this better world. That was a really interesting and very fascinating, and as I said, very thoughtful presentation. Thank you so much. That was terrific.
Thank you and the audience, and I enjoyed this a lot.
Oh, great. Thank you. And
Bye-bye.
Bye. I just want to say goodbye to everyone who's been watching. Thank you for watching. And we have one more lecture in this series on Friday. Professor Giovanni Andrea Cornea from the University of Florence in Italy is going to be talking about the situation in Italy and the impact of the pandemic on the Italian economy. And that should be very interesting. Friday, the 22nd of May at 6:30, the same time as this one. And so once again, Martin, thank you so much for this. And we hope we'll be in touch. Yeah?
Sure. You're very welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.